On the Pease River in December of 1860, Texas Rangers rode down a fleeing Comanche woman. She was screaming, not for help, in Comanche. She had a baby on her hip, and she fought them with everything she had. When they wiped the grime from her face, one of the men saw blue eyes. It was Cynthia Ann Parker, taken 24 years before. She did not want to be saved. The movies always showed the rescue as the ending. The record says it was the beginning of something worse. In the 1830s, the southern plains belonged to the Comanche, not on paper, on horseback. Their territory ran from the Arkansas River south to the Rio Grande, a sweep of land larger than most European nations, and they held it with a military system that the United States Army would spend 40 years trying to break. The Comanche were not one people. They were a loose confederation of bands. The Penateca in the south, ranging from the hill country of Texas to the Edwards Plateau. The Quahati in the west, deep on the staked plains where no white army dared to follow them. The Yamparica in the north, along the Canadian River. Each band raided independently, traded independently, made war on its own terms. And within that territory, captive taking was not chaos. It was structure. Women and children seized in raids moved through a network as organized as any trade route on the continent. A captive taken by one band could be traded to another, sold to a middleman, ransomed to a government agent, or absorbed into a family and never seen by the outside world again. The Republic of Texas knew this system existed. The Mexican state of Chihuahua knew. The United States Army knew. They all participated. They paid ransoms. They offered bounties. They signed treaties with captive return clauses that no one enforced. And so the system continued, decade after decade, because every party in it found the arrangement useful. To understand what really happened to these women, you cannot stop at the moment of capture. That moment is where the dime novels stop. The real story runs for years, across hundreds of miles, through the hands of warriors, traders, priests, officers, and politicians. And the question that follows it is not the one you expect. It is not which captivity was the most brutal. It is whether the worst thing that happened to these women was the taking or the bringing back. The sources we are using here are not Westerns. They are the women themselves. Rachel Plummer dictated her account to her father while she was still sick from what she had survived. She was 20 years old, and she would be dead within a year of speaking those words. Sarah Ann Horn published her narrative as a cheap pamphlet and sold it for pennies to keep herself fed in a world that did not want to hear what she had actually endured. Olive Oatman's story was taken from her hands and rewritten by a Methodist minister who needed a tale of Christian deliverance, not the complicated truth of a woman who may have chosen to stay. And Cynthia Ann Parker left no account at all, because no one in her white family understood the language she was speaking or the grief she was performing. Where their original words survive, we follow them. Where someone else rewrote those words for money or for meaning, we say so. That is the only honest promise this story can make. The chain began with men most Americans have never heard of, the Comancheros. They were traders, mostly New Mexican, operating out of adobe settlements along the Pecos River and the Canadian River in what is now eastern New Mexico. Small plazas built from mud and timber, a few dozen families in each, surrounded by the emptiest land on the continent. The Comancheros moved freely across the staked plains, the Llano Estacado, that vast flat tableland stretching from the Texas Panhandle west into New Mexico. The land itself was a barrier to anyone who did not know it. No trees, no landmarks, no water for days at a stretch. Temperatures that could freeze a man solid in January and kill him of thirst in July. The Comancheros knew the water holes and the buffalo wallow O's where a man could drink. They knew the cart trails worn into the grass by decades of use, and they carried everything the Comanche wanted: guns, powder, lead, whiskey and clay jugs, iron knives, steel needles. Bolts of manufactured cloth from the mills of New England carried 1,000 miles overland to be traded for stolen Texas cattle and human lives. They brought these goods to Comanche and Kiowa camps at established meeting points, and they left with cattle, horses, buffalo hides, and captives. This was not hidden. It had seasonal routes, known trading grounds, and prices that both sides understood before a single word was spoken. The Valley of Tears on the Staked Plains was one such ground. The name itself tells you what changed hands there. Trading fairs near Taos and San Miguel del Vado were others, held in the open, in daylight, with Mexican authorities fully aware. A man named Jose Piedad Tafoya appears repeatedly in United States Army records from the 1860s and 70s, named by officers stationed at Fort Bascom and in the field reports of Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's campaigns. Tafoya was one of the most active Comancheros on the southern plains, and the testimony of ransomed captives names him more than once. He was not a renegade living outside the law. He was a businessman operating inside a market that two nations tolerated because it served their purposes. A woman taken in a Comanche raid on a central Texas settlement could pass through 3 or 4 hands before anyone with a pen wrote her name down. She might be traded from a Penateca band to a Quahati band, sold to a Comanchero on the open plains, carried south to Chihuahua or west to Santa Fe, and ransomed back through a government agent months or years later. The distance between her capture and her recovery could be 1,000 miles. And every mile between made the record thinner and the woman harder to find. The word captive does not describe what waited at the other end of that chain. The dime novel sold an image of a white woman in chains, weeping in a teepee, waiting for rescue. That image is a lie. Many of the women who entered Comanche or Kiowa society were not held as prisoners in any sense a European would have recognized. They were adopted into families, given kinship roles, expected to work alongside the other women of the band, to scrape hides, to carry wood and water, to set up the lodge when the band moved and take it down when it moved again. Expected to learn the language, expected to bear children and raise them inside the band's customs. Some were treated as daughters. Some were treated as property. The line between the two was not fixed, and it could shift over time, depending on who had taken the woman and why. Among the Comanche, a woman seized to replace a dead daughter occupied a completely different standing from a woman taken as a spoil of a horse raid. The first might be mourned over and fed. The second might be beaten and worked until she proved her usefulness. The Comanche traced lineage through the father. A child born to a warrior was a child of the band, regardless of the mother's origin or her status. A captive who proved herself, who learned the Comanche tongue, who worked without complaint, who bore sons, could rise to a standing within the band that no white settlement in Texas would have offered a woman in that era. Women in Texas could not own property in their own name. Women in a Comanche band could own horses. This was not kindness. It was a system operating by its own rules, indifferent to whether the woman inside it had chosen to be there. But the picture of a screaming woman in irons is a lie built to sell paper and justify wars. And the truth is harder to hold because it has no clean villain and no clean rescue, and no moment where the audience gets to feel that justice arrived. Sarah Ann Horn found that truth in 1836. That year, a Comanche raiding party struck her family's settlement near Gonzales in south-central Texas, the same region where the battles of the Texas Revolution had raged just months before. Her husband was killed. She watched it happen. She and her infant son were taken and moved out onto the open plains. Over the next 2 years, she was traded between Comanche bands, moved through camps she could not name, in country she had never seen. She was separated from one of her boys. She walked hundreds of miles. She slept on the ground in winter with nothing between her body and the frozen earth but a single hide. She ate what the band ate, which in a lean season was almost nothing. She was eventually ransomed through a chain of intermediaries that ran from the plains to the Texas settlements, involving both Mexican traders and Texan agents. When she came back, she was destitute. No money, no husband, no home. One son recovered, the other gone. No trace, no word, no grave. So she wrote it down. Her narrative was published in 1839. It is one of the earliest Anglo-Texan captivity accounts, and it reads differently from the ones that came after. Horne was not writing literature. She was not writing a sermon. She was writing to eat. She describes the food she was given, the distances she walked, the cold that cracked the skin on her hands open to the blood beneath, the Comanche women who fed her broth when she was too weak to stand, and the men who struck her when she fell behind the march. She describes all of it in the same flat, exhausted sentences. There is no rising action. There is no deliverance. There is just one day after another. Later editors and publishers found this tone unmarketable. Not enough tears, not enough providence, not enough gratitude toward God and country. The pamphlet sold poorly and slipped out of memory. Sarah Ann Horne spent the rest of her life selling copies of her own suffering for a few cents apiece. That pamphlet is nearly gone from the record now. It should not be. Rachel Plummer's account makes Horne's look gentle. She was taken in the same season from the same part of Texas in the raid that would become the most famous in all of frontier history. On May 19, 1836, a Comanche war party struck Fort Parker, a small family stockade on the Navasota River in east-central Texas. The walls were nothing, a rough timber palisade thrown up on open ground barely higher than a man's head. The gate was standing open that morning. The Comanche rode straight through. They killed several men, including Elder John Parker, whose body they stripped and mutilated on the ground in full view of the women and children. Silas Parker was cut down trying to run. The screaming lasted minutes. Then it was over. 5 captives were taken. 2 of them would become legends, though not the kind anyone would have chosen. One was 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker. The other was her cousin by marriage, Rachel Plummer, who was 17 years old and pregnant. Rachel gave birth in captivity. The baby was taken from her. In her narrative, dictated to her father, James W. Parker, after her return, she describes the moment the infant was carried away. She tells it without drama, because there was none to add. They took the child. She heard it cry once. Then she did not hear it again. She believed they killed it. She was held for roughly 18 months. She was beaten. She was starved during lean stretches when the whole band went hungry. She was moved from camp to camp, band to band, across country that blurred into a single endless grassland, under a sky that offered no shelter. And then she did something the dime novels never included. She fought back. She describes a physical confrontation with another woman in the band, a real fight with fists and stones, and she won it. That single act of violence changed her standing. The Comanche saw something in her they recognized, and they respected it. She was ransomed through Santa Fe in 1837. Her father arranged the publication of her narrative in 1838. It is one of the most brutally direct captivity accounts in American frontier literature. She does not flinch from what was done to her. She does not moralize about the people who did it. She tells you what happened to her body and her mind, and she does not soften it for your comfort. Rachel Plummer died in 1839. She was 21 years old. What she had endured killed her slowly, and it killed her completely. Her narrative survived because her father would not let it disappear. Every later captivity writer in America raided that text and smoothed its edges until it fit the formula. The original is harder. It is also the closest thing to the truth that we have from inside those years. The women's stories were at least written down. The children's stories were not. Multiple captive women bore children by Comanche or Kiowa men, and those children grew up inside the band as full and accepted members. The Comanche did not distinguish. A warrior's child was a warrior's child. The problem was not the band. The problem was what happened when the mother was ransomed or recaptured, because then the child was dragged between two worlds and neither one would close around them. Some children were carried back into white settlements where they were called half-breeds, a word that carried legal and social weight through the entire 19th century. It barred them from schools. It barred them from churches. It followed them into courthouses and kept following them into graves. Other children were left behind with the band when the mother was taken back, and the separation was total and permanent. There was no letter. There was no visit. The child simply ceased to exist in one world and continued in the other. Cynthia Ann Parker's daughter, Prairie Flower, was brought back with her mother to White, Texas in 1860. She was a toddler. She died in 1864 of influenza and perhaps of something harder to name. She was roughly 4 years old. She did not survive the world her mother had been forced back into. Quanah Parker, Cynthia Ann's son, was not taken in the Peace River raid. He remained with the Quahati Comanche and rose to become the last great Comanche war chief, the man who held the Staked Plains longer than any other leader. After the wars ended and the Comanche were driven onto the reservation near Fort Sill, Quanah spent years petitioning the federal government to move his mother's remains to Comanche ground. In 1910, he succeeded. He brought her home. The children born of captivity are the invisible cost of this whole history. They had no pamphlet, no publisher, no minister to reshape their suffering into a lesson. They appear in agency rolls and burial lists, and then they vanish into the space between peoples, and the records do not follow them there. There was a price on every one of these women, a market price, stated plainly in dollars or in trade goods, understood by every party in the chain. In the 1830s and 40s, a captive white woman on the southern plains could be ransomed for goods worth roughly $150 to $300. In that era, a working man might earn $1 a day. A good horse cost $40 to $60, so a woman's ransom was the price of a small herd. The figure moved depending on the captive's age, her perceived value to the band, the buyer's leverage, and the political climate of the moment. The Republic of Texas paid ransoms. The United States Army paid ransoms. The Mexican government paid ransoms, sometimes directly, handing goods or coin to a Comanche chief across a treaty table. Sometimes through Comanchero middlemen who took their own cut. Sometimes through other tribes acting as brokers. The Delaware and the Wichita served as go-betweens in several documented cases. Treaties periodically promised captive returns. The 1853 Fort Atkinson Treaty between the United States and the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache nations included such a clause. No one enforced it. Enforcement would have required riding onto the Staked Plains and demanding compliance from people who had no reason to comply. And the whole arrangement created a perverse incentive that everyone could see and no one stopped. The more a captive was worth, the more profitable a raid became. Several historians have argued, with the evidence behind them, that American and Mexican ransom payments directly prolonged the captive trade by decades. The governments that wept publicly over stolen white women were the same governments whose money made stealing them worthwhile. That scene was never filmed. That chapter was never written in any novel or memoir that reached the public. But the ledgers are still in the archives. Ransom payments recorded in Army quartermaster files at Fort Sill, at Fort Bascom, at the Comanche Agency. Goods dispersed, captives received. Columns of figures in faded ink, each line representing a life bought back at a price that made the next raid inevitable. The numbers do not lie, and they do not appear in any Western you have ever seen. And here is where the question I planted at the start begins to cut deep. Because when these women were finally brought back, when the ransom was paid or the Rangers rode in, the story was supposed to end with gratitude. The weeping woman on her knees, the embrace, the homecoming. In the actual record, that ending barely exists. Multiple documented cases describe women who resisted repatriation with everything they had. Some had married Comanche or Kiowa men and considered those marriages as real as any performed in a church. Some had borne children and would not leave them behind. Some had been gone so long that English was a foreign language in their mouths. And some understood with a clarity that only experience teaches what was waiting for them on the other side. A white woman who had lived among the Comanche was considered damaged beyond repair by the society she was being returned to, sexually ruined, unfit for respectable company, unfit for marriage, unfit for church. The stigma was not quiet. It was public, and it was permanent. Congregations debated whether returned captives could sit in the pews. Families debated whether to say their names aloud. In some documented cases, women came back and found white society so unbearable, so much colder than what they had left, that they tried to walk back to the reservation. The Army stopped them at the boundary and turned them back. Some tried more than once. The records at Fort Sill after 1875, kept by officers and Indian agents stationed at the Comanche and Kiowa reservation, include case after case. Women who refused to eat, women who struck the soldiers removing them, women who sat down on the ground and would not stand, children who screamed for hours when they were carried away from the Comanche families who had raised them, women who went silent the day they were handed over to white relatives and did not speak again for months. These were not rescues. They were removals dressed in the language of salvation. The women inside those reports would not have recognized a word of it. After the Red River War of 1874 and 75 and the final military collapse of the Southern Plains tribes, the federal government launched what it called reclamation campaigns. The word itself tells you everything you need to know about how those campaigns understood the people they were taking. Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry drove the operations out of Fort Sill in Indian Territory. These were systematic sweeps to find and remove white and Mexican captives still living with Comanche and Kiowa bands on the reservations. The government framed it as humanitarian work, the rescue of stolen innocence. In practice, the campaigns were forced separations conducted by armed men against people who did not want to go. Women and children who had lived among the Comanche for 10, 15, 20 years were pulled from the only families they knew. They were photographed for identification. Some of those photographs survive in the National Archives. Gaunt women in government-issued dresses standing in front of agency buildings. Children pressed against their legs, staring into the camera with an expression the photographer did not caption and the agency did not explain. The women were placed with white families or sent to institutions. Children were shipped to boarding schools hundreds of miles away. The transitions were catastrophic. Some women stopped eating and had to be fed by force. Some tried to walk the distance back to the reservation. The government kept almost no records of what happened to most of these people after their recovery was filed. They were marked as saved, and then they disappeared from the paper trail. Not lost to the plains, lost to bureaucracy. The cruelest kind of erasure because it came with a stamp of approval. And then there was Olive Oatman. You know her face, even if you have never heard her name. The chin tattoo. 2 thick blue lines running from her lower lip down to her jawline. It is one of the most reproduced images in frontier history. But the story behind that face was rewritten before anyone thought to ask the woman wearing it what it meant. In February of 1851, Olive was 13 or perhaps 14 years old, traveling west with her family and a small Mormon splinter group along the Gila River in what is now western Arizona. The country was open desert, dry washes and rock, nothing between the party and the horizon in any direction. A band of western Yavapai attacked. Olive's parents were killed. 4 of her siblings were killed. Olive and her younger sister Mary Ann were taken. Within roughly a year, they were traded to the Mojave, some hundreds of miles north along the Colorado River. Mary Ann starved to death during a famine that struck the Mojave in 1852 or 53. Olive survived. She lived among the Mojave for 4 to 5 years. She ate their food. She worked their fields. The tattoo on her chin was a Mojave custom, a mark applied to their own women, not to outsiders. It was not a brand of ownership. It was a sign that the woman who wore it belonged. Olive herself said later that she had been treated well among the Mojave. In 1856, she was ransomed and returned to Fort Yuma through negotiations that involved a Mojave leader sometimes recorded as Espaneo. Her brother Lorenzo, who had survived the original attack and spent 5 years searching for her, was there to meet her, and almost immediately, a Methodist minister named Royal B. Stratton took her story and turned it into product. His book, published in 1857 under the title Captivity of the Oatman Girls, was a conversion narrative engineered to sell. The suffering maiden, the savage wilderness, the miracle of God's mercy. Stratton rewrote the central facts of Olive's experience to fit a mold that the reading public wanted and the church could endorse. Historians, Brian McGinty among them, have built a credible case that Olive had a Mojave husband and may have borne a child during her years with the tribe. If true, Stratton buried it completely. He had to. A woman who had married a Mojave man and given him a child could not stand at the center of a Christian rescue narrative. She would have been unmarriageable, unpublishable, unspeakable. So Stratton wrote the version that worked, and Olive never publicly contradicted him. She also never told her own version. She spent the remainder of her life in quiet obscurity, and reportedly would not discuss the Mojave years with anyone. That silence is the loudest thing in her entire story. Whatever the truth was, Royal Stratton made certain the public would never hear it from the only person who lived it. Now we come back to the Peace River, December of 1860. Cynthia Ann Parker, screaming in Comanche, fighting the Texas Rangers, dragging her off her horse, holding her daughter so tightly the men had to pry the child from her arms. This is where the whole story arrives. She was taken on May 19, 1836, from Fort Parker, in the same raid that took Rachel Plummer. She was 9 years old. For 24 years, she lived as a Comanche woman on the southern plains. She married Peta Nocona, a war chief of the Quahati band. She bore him at least 3 children, including Quana. She dressed in hides. She rode. She spoke the language as her own. She moved with the band across the staked plains with the seasons, following the buffalo, camping at the springs and river bends her husband's people had used for generations. By every account that survives from inside the Comanche world, she was Comanche. She had no memory of wanting anything else and no desire to be reminded. Sol Ross and his rangers took her from a hunting camp on the Peace River. The details of that engagement are disputed. Ross claimed a great battle. Comanche sources describe a smaller action against a camp of women and old men. Whether Pita Nocona was present and killed that day or survived and died later is contested between Anglo-Texan accounts and Comanche oral tradition. What is not disputed is that Cynthia Ann was taken against her will. The Texas legislature voted her a pension and a league of land. They called this an act of kindness. Her white relatives received her. She did not know their faces. She tried to run. More than once. She cut herself in mourning, slashing her own breasts, a Comanche grief practice that the white family around her read as madness. They could not see what she was doing. She was performing the only ceremony she knew for the loss of everything. Prairie Flower died in 1864. Cynthia Ann followed in 1871. The records disagree on what killed her. Influenza, some say. Others say she stopped eating and did not start again. She was buried in Texas, far from the plains she had called home for a quarter of a century. Quanah Parker worked for years to bring her remains to Comanche country. In 1910, he succeeded. She lies now in Oklahoma, beside her son in Comanche ground, where she asked to be all along. The pension the Texas legislature voted her went unspent. The league of land they granted her went unclaimed. The white family they returned her to could not hold her because she was never theirs to hold. The rescue that Texas celebrated for 100 years killed her as surely as any weapon ever forged. That is not a reading of the evidence. That is the evidence itself. So why does the popular story of frontier captivity always end at the rescue? Because the people who controlled the telling needed it to. The captivity narratives published through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s all follow the same careful arc. Capture, suffering, deliverance, gratitude. The formula tightened with every decade. Rachel Plummer's narrative, written before that pattern hardened into iron, reads like a woman talking to her father. It has no redemption arc because Rachel was not redeemed. She was ransomed, and then she died. By the time Royal Stratton published the Oatman book 20 years later, every honest edge had been filed down. The woman at the center had become a character serving someone else's purpose. The minister's theology had replaced her memory. The formula held because it served everyone except the woman it claimed to honor. It served the publisher who needed sales, the minister who needed proof of providence, the government that needed to point at stolen women and say, "This is why we send the cavalry." The woman's real experience, her Comanche husband, her children, her refusal to leave, her silence when she was forced back, none of that served the story. It could not be printed in a church circular. It could not be read aloud in a parlor. It could not justify a war appropriation. So none of it survived the editing. The women's real words were cut and replaced with words that sold. The myth makers had names, and they should be spoken plainly. Royal B. Stratton, who turned Olive Oatman's life into a sermon and buried what may have been the most important truth she carried. The dime novelists of the 1850s and 60s, who turned captivity into cheap sensation and hammered the phrase, "a fate worse than death," into the language so hard that it replaced every honest sentence these women ever spoke. They printed millions of copies, and not one asked the woman on the cover what she actually remembered. John Ford, who took the bones of Cynthia Ann Parker's life and made The Searchers in 1956. Natalie Wood in Brownface. The rescue played as Triumph. The credits rolling before anyone in the audience had to sit with the cost. The real Cynthia Ann Parker, fighting and mourning and starving herself toward death, was not in John Ford's film and could never have been. And the state of Texas, which built the story of her recovery into its founding mythology and held it there for more than a century before a single voice in authority asked what the rescue had done to the woman at the center of it. The worst thing that happened to these women was not the capture. It was the world that called itself civilized and waited for them on the other side. Editors who took their words and made them disappear. A government that carried them home and lost the file. The frontier traded these women twice. Once into the plains, once back out again. The second trade is the one that no one recorded honestly. Their own words are still in the archives, in faded pamphlets and letters nobody opens. They should.